The feeling of being a landowner was a new and exhilarating experience to me. To be able to say that this fine stretch of land is my own, my very own, does something to one's ego. It gives one a sense of security, of stability, of belonging, and of being a part of the land itself. Many times I would go out in the evening of the day and with a feeling of inward satisfaction and pride, survey with my eyes my new estate, happy in the thought that all this was my own, that I was part of this new community and was contributing my share in converting a wilderness into a civilized habitation for men, women, and children, just as our pioneer forefathers had done when they took possession of other parts of our country. But as I look back now, I realize that those were the dreams of a youthful idealist. All pioneers are idealists and enthusiasts. If they were not, they would never have the urge or the courage to leave the old established homeland and risk their fortune in a new uncharted world. The name of my book is Staking Her Claim, Women Homesteading the West. It features the stories of women who homesteaded alone, not with a family, not with a husband. They chose to homestead by themselves. It covers approximately the early 1900s up to, I think the latest homesteader in my book is actually 1930s. Women were allowed to own homestead ever since the Homestead Act was enacted in 1862, because it said that any head of household could homestead if they were 21 years old. And a single woman was considered a head of household just as a man was. So when they began to figure that out and other factors began to make homesteading more possible, like for example trains, the opening of trains into the West meant that a woman didn't have to go on a wagon train pulled by oxen. She could get on a train and go to Wyoming or Montana or wherever the land was available. And that made a huge, huge difference. The early part of the 20th century was a time of change for women. They're just coming out of the Victorian period where women's role was thought to be in the home. And the sphere of their children and the family. But women's suffrage had started. Women trying to get the vote, the temperance movement, which was fueled by women. All of these things were taking place. There were opportunities for women to teach school and to get out and begin to get training and be in the professions. So all of this was beginning to happen, and I think it opened up horizons for women who wanted to have the economic opportunity of homesteading. I think they had a sense of adventure, and many of them spoke about feeling very confined in their roles back home. I mean, those that made the choice on their own to do that. They wanted to move west. The West had that aura of opportunity about it, and they wanted to be part of that. And as I said, since the stereotype of the woman has to stay home was changing, they were able to do that. And actually another factor I found that kind of surprised me, although I don't know why, was economic security. They were looking for economic security. Think about the position of a woman at that time. If she was unmarried, she had no pension, she had no Social Security. What was to become of her if she never married? So owning property was a way to ensure some economic security. And almost every woman who wrote about her experience talked about that, the importance of the economic security that she was seeking. When a woman started out to homestead, she first had to find land to file on. And often that meant she would take a trip to that place and just go out with a land locator. And the land locator facilitated people going out and finding where the land was available. So that might be in a Model T Ford or on a horseback. So she'd find the land, she'd do her best to choose something that looked good and the locator thought was appropriate. Then she'd go back and file. Then she had to build a place to live. And in most cases, for the women that are in my book, they were building not these charming log cabins that you picture, but they were building tar paper shacks, 9 by 12. That was the minimum you had to build. And they, you know, this was a kind of a new venture for them. They didn't know if they would succeed. They had to live on this land from 3 to 5 years in order to prove up. So they usually, unless they had a lot of money, they did the minimum. Then they had to prove up on the land. Now, proving up meant they had to make it productive in some way. So they had, usually that meant a garden or a crop of some sort. And so they would have to live on the land and make that happen. And it wasn't easy. As I said, most of the good prime river and property and stream property was already taken. So they often would maybe even have to carry water to their gardens from a well. Some of the hardships they faced, oftentimes they would be living in an isolated place, and they wouldn't have companionship. Sometimes, occasionally, there were stories of them being frightened. Not as much as you would think, and I think that's an interesting aspect, that when they were writing about their experiences, they tended to write about the good things, and they didn't emphasize what must have been some very difficult times. They had trouble growing their crops. They'd grow, I mean, you can imagine, they're out here in this uncharted territory. They build a garden, and every rabbit in 10-mile radius is coming to eat their garden. And so they had those kinds of difficulties. Sometimes they were fearful of people in the region maybe coming by their house, like men. One woman describes being in her cabin in a winter night and the wolves howling all around the cabin, and she was afraid of the wolves. And so yeah, being those encounters with nature alone, but they had to love nature to a certain extent to be willing to even think about doing this, and most of them did. They had to be able to endure solitude well. They had to be able to keep themselves busy. And however, some women did come out with friends or sisters, family members. One couple of women I think about were in Warland, Wyoming, and they were friends, and they homesteaded claims right next to each other, and instead of building 2 separate claim shacks, they built one claim shack that straddled the property line, and that sufficed for the proving up requirement, and they lived there together and helped each other out. Helen Coburn Howell and Mary Culbertson were the 2 women who homesteaded in Warland, and they had kind of an interesting story because they were from Iowa. They were from a very nice little town, and their dads had invested in this irrigation project in Warland. So they, one of the women said she came home from college, and her dad said, well, hey, instead of going back to college next year, how would you like to go out to Wyoming and homestead? And I mean, she did not know what she was getting into. She was so clueless that when she packed a tennis racket to go out to Warland, Wyoming. Well, Warland was barely a town. I mean, it was just a few little buildings, and she ended up teaching school, and she met a man there and married him and lived in Warland the rest of her life. But it was quite an interesting story there. And she was the one, she has a very interesting in her account of voting for the first time. Because of course you could vote in Wyoming when you couldn't in other states. So that was a big deal when they first got to go vote in Wyoming. There are a couple of women that I thought I'd mention. One is a woman named Alice Newberry. And Alice is one of the ones who homesteaded in a dugout. She lived in a dugout in eastern Colorado, though, but it could have been anywhere, very much like Wyoming. And so she had some interesting experiences living in a dugout. killing snakes was often something that she had to do. And interestingly, many of the women's stories talk about the snakes. They talk about encountering snakes. And I think that has such interesting implications symbolically, because here are the women out in the natural world, and there are snakes in the garden, so to speak, in the biblical sense. But anyway, I think Alice was writing letters home to her mother and her brother. So I'd like to read just a little bit from one of the letters she writes to her mother, and it has to do with planting the crops on her land. She called her place the burrow, since she was in a dugout. But she says, "Dear Mama, when I wrote you about a month ago, I did not tell you that I have a boarder. I didn't have him then, I believe. He's putting in the crop on my farm. Mr. Wellman furnishes the team and the man and the seed and the farming implements and is farming my land." And I'm going to stop here just a minute, because that was something that women homesteaders usually had to be able to hire someone for that really heavy work of plowing and planting. "I have to have so much land tilled in order to prove up. Breaking costs $2 for every acre broken. This way it costs me nothing but the month's board and bother of having the man. He is a very good, mild, meek, patient, respectable married man from North Dakota." Now, when you first hear that, you have to stop and think. She's writing to her mother about a man who's living on this property with her alone out in the middle of nowhere. And how would your mother react to that situation? So she's trying to reassure her mother that nothing inappropriate is happening. "There was no one else to board him, because by the time he drove the team back and forth from Wellman's here, 10 miles, the remainder of the day would not count for much. And anyway, he is so slow. Then it would be hard on the horses, and breaking the sod seems to tire them very much as it is. I am sure there never was a man who ate so much as Henry. He is very nice to cook for, because he eats all of my experiments without a murmur, but there's usually very little left over to warm up. He will get through this week, and I know it's wicked, but I want to say, praise the Lord. I wouldn't be married for anything, not to a man who eats so much. It takes all my time to cook." And she did not marry. She writes in a later letter to her mother after Henry's left. She says, "I have decided not to marry. 3 warm meals a day, 365 days in the year for the term of my natural life is more than I can face. I have decided to study up a little and try to fit myself for a higher calling." And she was already a school teacher. She was teaching around in the area. And she did go back to school in summers, and she eventually did leave the land after she'd proved up. But she kept that land in the family, and although she didn't have children of her own, she willed it to her nieces and nephews, and they still own that land. So I think that's a lovely story, and it gives you a sense of the kinds of things they were dealing with. When I first came to Wyoming, I read a book called Letters of a Woman Homesteader about a single woman who homesteaded and near Rock Springs, Wyoming. And at the same time, I was taking a class in Western history. The Western history textbook kind of summarized all of women's experience in the West by saying they were reluctant pioneers. Well, this woman homesteader I'd been reading about was anything but reluctant. She was very excited. And in fact, that's one of the motivating factors for me to write the book, because there was this disparity between what the historians were saying, and which was not even recognizing that there were single women who homesteaded. So I wanted to find out if there were indeed other women, and if there were, how did they feel about it? I mean, were they positive? And so when I found that there were 12% of all homesteaders were single women, that's a significant number of people to have homesteaded. So I feel like single women at that time, homesteading, they were validating that notion of greater freedom for women. And I think they were kind of breaking trail for those of us who followed in realizing that women can own property, they can take care of property, they can farm, they can manage their lives quite well independently.